Thank you, friends, for taking time out of such a beautiful day for us to have a conversation. Um, I want to have a conversation that is, for me, very much about the heart of things. It's a conversation about what it means to be human, how to live a more humane existence. And to start out with that question that keeps so many of us occupied, which is why are so many of us, including so many of our students, so stressed out and so anxious um, in a way that is quite disconcerting? If you care about people and we care about each other, we care about our students, you want to see people do well. And when you see folks frazzled and worn out, it leads you to pause and ask that question of, do things have to be this way? Maybe there is a better way. So I kind of want to just share some big picture reflections. And it starts out with the question that so often is posed to a lot of our students when they get close to graduation. By senior year, you're pretty much bombarded with it. But even before then, and it's that magical question of, what are you going to do after graduation? What are you going to do with your life? And sometimes I have wished that we would have a culture of being a little bit more generous with each other. It's been helpful for me to remember, as somebody who studies multiple religious traditions, that that good old socialist first century Palestinian Jew Jesus doesn't figure out that he's the Christ until he's 30. And that Indian prince, Siddhartha, doesn't become the Buddha until he's 35. And that Arabian mystic and merchant Muhammad doesn't figure out that he's meant to be the prophet until he's 40. Now, our students are amazing, but you're not any cooler than Jesus. You're not any more enlightened than the Buddha. You're not any more mystical than Muhammad. So why should we expect that you have all of your life figured out by the time you're 21 or 22? So I want to kind of pause and think about some of these buzzwords, loaded words that we hear so often in elite institutions. And you hear these words certainly often enough at Duke, but this is not a Duke problem. In some ways, these are the coded language of a pressure-filled life in many of our academic institutions, and after that in many of our corporate institutions. And the three that I picked out are, the kids these days, they don't play bingo, but maybe your grandparents did. If you were playing bingo, you could probably shout out as soon as you hear these three words come together: success, leadership, excellence, right? Bingo, success, leadership, excellence. Now, excellence is probably the least offensive of them. We all would like to live an excellent life. We hope that people are excellent morally. So we're going to just let that one be in the interest of time. But I want to ask that question about leadership. Very often, we use language like, we're in the business of training global leaders. Sounds great. But if everybody's leading, then who is following? How do we come up with a conversation where the language of teamwork, group work, and even, heaven forbid, followership becomes as recognized, as valued as the language of leadership, The best example of this that I can give is that the first year that I came back to Duke, I was a Duke undergrad, a Duke master's, and a Duke PhD. Got married in the Duke Gardens. They'll probably bury me in some corner of the campus at some point. That's about the only thing that I have left. The first year that I came back to Duke in 2014, from what I was told, we had 19 new student organizations that were proposed to deal with the crisis of Syrian refugees. 19 students who were putting themselves forth as the campus leader to deal with the challenge of Syrian refugees. Well, how about these folks getting together? They all can't be the president and the founder, but maybe 19 people pulling together can be much more effective than 19 new organizations trying to be started. When we think about this idea of success, right? Sometimes we think of this in this very teleological way, in this very linear way. Think about the way that we do our resumes and our CVs. Right? I got my degree from here, I worked for X number of years here, and then after, and then after. But real life doesn't work like this. Your career, my career, our careers don't work like this, and our personal lives surely don't work like this. It is not simply a progress from one success to another. Quite often in our life, we fall flat on our face. We fail, and oftentimes miserably so. Our personal lives are like this, right? People ask you, are you married? And I might say, yes, I'm married. And in fact, my wife and I just had a baby girl 7 weeks ago. At what point during that telling of one's life story is there room to say, from when I started out in college until I met and married my wife, I got my heart broken 7 times. I was married before, and it was really a struggle. And I gave it everything, and it didn't work out. Now, that's a much more complicated and uncomfortable answer than, yeah, I'm married and we just had kids 7 weeks ago. But it honors the fact that life is messy, life is complicated. We fail. We fail personally. We fail with respect to many of those who are closest to us. We fail in our jobs. And part of what I hope we can cultivate is a culture that talks about buoyancy, that talks about how do you get back up from the ground once you've fallen, depending on the metaphor that you like, flat on your face or on your behind. There's a wonderful quote that Samuel Beckett has about this, which I've used to tape it to my computer. Ever tried, ever failed? No matter. Tried again, fail again. Fail better. That's not quite as sexy and dramatic as this linear model of success, but this idea that sometimes in life, learning to fail better is actually part of the growing process and the growing pains that we all have to go through. Learning to heal after pain and suffering. Being aware enough of what hurts in us and noticing the pain and the struggles of those around us. I've got a few very short provocations, invitations for us to come back to, given the relatively short amount of time that we have. And this first one comes from an Islamic mystical text from 1,000 years ago. Very simple saying, have your heart be where your feet are. Have your heart be where your feet are. be wholeheartedly present in that breath that you are occupying at the moment. When I think about us as a learning community, as an educational community, and I deliberately ask my students when they're introducing themselves on the first day of class, I don't want to hear about what you're majoring in. That's actually one of the most boring questions that you could try to answer. I want you to tell me what you're passionate about. I want to tell me what moves you, what inspires you, and what keeps you up in the middle of the night. And the answer that I get back often is, I'm pre-med, I'm pre-law, or I'm getting the marketing certificate at Duke. And my worry is that in this pre-professional culture that we're all participating in, I write 125 rec letters a year. So I'm complicit in this. That we're training a generation of people who in many ways are not just pre-med and pre-law and pre-consulting, they're pre-life. We fall into the trap of thinking that real life will begin when I've gotten out of med school or law school, got the first job and the second job, the first semester right and the second semester right, and the first Mrs. Right and the second Mrs. Right. We're always putting off when real life is supposed to start. And I want us to have a sense that no, these are really precious years of life. Have your heart be where your feet are. The opportunity to explore, to ask those challenging questions about who am I and who do I wish to become? What has been the wisdom tradition of love and beauty and music and philosophy from around the world? What are the mysteries of nature and how do I relate to them? This is an extraordinary opportunity to dive into them. Related to that is the question, the challenge, the opportunity to keep exploring our hearts. And I don't mean that in a wishy-washy fluff kind of a way. I'm a fairly mean professor on the first day of class. I always have about a third of my students drop my class on the first day, which is a little interesting. And one of the reasons is that I've got this funny little rule: no laptops, no cell phones can be pulled out in class. And part of it is, the reason for it is that when I sit in the classrooms of my colleagues to evaluate them, and I'm sitting behind where the students are sitting, it breaks my heart to see what's actually happening on their computer screens. They're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, they're chatting, they're doing this, and somehow they're still raising their hand periodically to answer questions. I want the classroom to be a sacred space. I want the classroom to be a space where we're wholly present to one another. So closing the laptop, which I know is hard to do in an age of Zoom, is important for that. When we take a break in the middle of the class, or when the class ends and the students leave, some students, like, they're practically shaking and trembling because they haven't checked their phones in an hour and 15 minutes. And the analogy that comes to my mind is, if you go to a cafe, the day will come where we can go back to cafes or to a library. People are vying not for the place with the most beautiful view, but for the place that they can plug in. They can plug in their devices, their phone and their computer. And that, if God forbid that red battery lights on their phones come out, people go into, this cosmic and existential state of panic that I must recharge. Is there anything in our education that would encourage us, allow us to get to know ourselves well enough so that we figure out how we ourselves, our hearts, our souls can be rejuvenated. Do you know when you get down, where do you have to go to rejuvenate yourself? Is it a place? Is it Eno River? Is it Duke Forest? Is it an activity, listening to music, reading poetry, perhaps for some prayer or meditation? Is it a person? Is it sitting down with your mama? Is it cuddling with a lover? Is it eating a certain kind of food? Do you know yourself well enough to know what rejuvenates you? And it's possible that what rejuvenated you when you're 18 is no longer what rejuvenates you when you're 25 or 50. It's possible that what rejuvenated your ancestors may no longer be exactly in the same form as what rejuvenates you. One of the epitomes of this culture, and if you think about it, we have words like multitasking. And some of us take pride in being able to multitask. I'm not sure that we have a regularly used, beautiful word for single tasking, to make sure that in that moment, the person that we are with, what we are reading, what we're writing, receives our wholehearted attention. The way that this shows up for me is, being someone who studies languages and literature, I'm fascinated by how we greet one another. So if you ask a question as mundane as, how are you? Ask a mundane question, you're going to get a mundane answer. And the mundane answer that I keep hearing for the last 15 years, maybe 20, is this nervous head shake. Oh, I'm just so busy, so busy, so busy. And I've never seen a person smile when they say that they're busy. Like, none of us want to live like this. How do we end up here? How do we create a different culture? What's interesting is that in many of the Middle Eastern, North African cultures that I study, you don't ask people, how are you? The question that you ask is quite literally, how is your heart in this breath? How is your heart doing in this breath? And I've sometimes experimented, rather than asking people, how are you? To which most people respond by reiterating their to-do list. Well, I've got all these things going on, and a project that's due, and 150 emails that I received today that I have to respond to. But if you change the question and you say, how is your heart doing in this moment? They sort of pause, and oftentimes, rather than answering that question with their to-do list, it encourages them to sort of look within and say, well, actually, I'm feeling a little drained and kind of overwhelmed. How is your heart? And then all of a sudden, instead of one of those conversations that we repeat 100 times a day and perhaps remember nothing from it, it helps to create a sense of community among us. I think the last thing that I want us to leave with and open it up for Q&A is, we talked about success, leadership, excellence. And I want to come back to this idea of success, and success when it's reduced to a kind of material and financial success. Every study that I've ever read in my life, yeah, there is a bottom line that if you're living in poverty below that, it's quite difficult to be truly joyful in life. If you don't have a roof over your head, if you're not only have no food in your own belly, but if you're having to see your loved ones go hungry, it's very difficult to live a joyful life. But above that, at a certain point, there ceases to be any direct correlation between your material well-being and your level of joy in life. You start comparing yourself with the people around you rather than some sense of um, more factual aspect of your needs and desires. And I think part of that is that we oftentimes define success individually. Even our resumes and our CVs are resumes and CVs for one person. What if we started to define things the way that many spiritual traditions do, which is to start with the notion that I can't be who I ought to be until and unless you are everything that you ought to be, that there is a notion of togetherness, of the beloved community, the mother community, as the Muslims would refer to it. And so I encourage us, as we're trying to get out of this isolated notion of individual success, to start asking those questions of who's in my boat? When life gets really turbulent and the waves of life are coming crashing at me, and if I'm fortunate enough to have a lifeboat, who's in that boat with me? Who is it that I don't even have to turn around and see if they're still in my boat? All I have to do is to extend my hand and they will grab it because they're there with me. And in whose boat am I? Who am I there for? Who am I there with? Maybe in the Q&A, I might talk a little bit more about the way that this sometimes gets articulated as cultivating these circles of compassion that begin with yourself and expand towards your family, your neighborhood, your state, your nation, your religious community, and eventually the whole of humanity. We could come back to that. I'm going to end and open it up by just two quick little reminders. And these are two quotes that are some of these guiding principles for me. We're just coming out of a 4-year nightmare, national and international nightmare, where a misogynist narcissist rose up with zero qualifications in politics, rose up to the most important political office in the world. How does that happen? What does that say about us? What does that say about what we come to value as a successful person? So I'm going to read this little quote from Brother West, Cornel West. He says, if your success is defined as being well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference, then we don't want successful leaders. We want great leaders. Leaders who love the people enough and respect the people enough to be unsought, unbound, unafraid, and unintimidated to tell the truth. William mentioned that other than being interested in the tradition of Islamic mysticism, I also have an abiding commitment to the freedom movement, the Black-led freedom movement. Some people would call that the civil rights movement. When Dr. King was being buried, his family asked for one of his lesser known speeches to be played at the funeral. I wish sometimes that there would be a moratorium on the I have a dream speech so that we could actually study the other ones. And this is his drum major instinct, where he goes on to redefine greatness, greatness, not as the measure of your education, not as the measure of your wealth, not as your fame and recognition, but as the capacity to love and as the capacity to serve. And it says everybody can love and everybody can serve. It says you want to be right on the war question. You try to feed the hungry, clothe those who are naked, visit those who are in prison, to try to love and serve humanity. So to open it up, yeah, I want us to be an excellent community. I want our students to be excellent students. I want our teachers to be excellent teachers. But I want the definition of greatness to look different. Not just the accumulation of personal accolades and material success and titles, but that most alchemical and transformative of impacts that we can have on one another, the gifts and the ability to love and to serve. So let me pause here and maybe we can shift to a different kind of conversation.